Father, and from Jesus Christ our Lord be with you all. At the beginning of service, you folks have done a wonderful job in proclaiming with joy that Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Hallelujah. However, if somebody stops you and asks, can you tell us what it means? Have you seen Jesus? What are we talking about when we proclaim that Jesus Christ is living today, and not just living, but is our resurrected Lord? You see, many of us have family members or loved ones that have gone on before us. We have sadness, but afterwards we can always say to others that the person, our loved ones, is still living in us and with us, but in the sense of living in our memory. And sometimes their memories, the memory of them, give us joy, but also sometimes give us a little headache as well. But when we say Christ is risen, He is risen indeed. We are not talking about that kind of living reality. We are talking about having Jesus as our Lord. Jesus is someone that we pray to, and Jesus is the one who would lead us into God's future. It could all sound pretty abstract and vague. So when people ask us what it means, how are we going to answer that question? So I think today, the very famous text of the two disciples walking towards Emmaus give us another glimpse of another ways of looking at Christ's living presence. And in here, this text, what we are looking at is how Jesus present in our midst when in human relationships, in community. You know, I carry my, I hope I can still find it, my badge for work. Does that look familiar to you all? Well, no, not yet, but you will. If I can, sorry. So, how many of you have something like this? You wear daily, right? And that's how we got recognized, right? We wear this, and people let you in, and then in a particular place, you wear this, so the electronic door could open for you in each floor. So that's how we recognize Jesus. But in our human relationship with one another, how do we recognize Jesus? I have three major points I want to share this morning. The first one is whether or not we can see Jesus is not a choice. Let me repeat that. Whether or not we can see Jesus is not a decision that we make. In the text today, it's pretty obvious. It says that while Jesus appeared to the two disciples, they could not see Him. But the phrase is very specific. It said they were being held. They were being held from seeing Jesus. And in fact, the Greek word here is they were being shut off. They were being forced to shut down, or their eyes being forced to shut down passively so that they could not see Jesus. And then likewise, later on, during the breaking of bread, they begin to see Jesus. Again, it's in passive voice, meaning that they did not see Jesus out of their own volition, but rather they were allowed to have their eyes opened so that Jesus could be recognized by them. This is a very key point. We don't get to choose whether we know Jesus is present or not. It's God's choice. And that's why in biblical witnesses, in the scriptures, nobody tells us you need to go there, you need to do that so that you will see Jesus. Otherwise, Jesus will be just like anybody else. God will be just like anything on earth. We can choose to receive or not. Jesus is God. It's God's choice for us. And so all the biblical witness is doing is tell us from their experience collectively and individually where they have experienced Jesus in significant ways. So that's point number one. God opens our eyes and shut our eyes in some ways whether we could see Jesus. So that gets to the second major point of how do we experience Jesus in community, in human relationships? I have several sub-points under this big point. The first point is, actually, if you look at the text carefully, it does look like a worship service. Let's look at that. They were walking together, that's one thing, but after Jesus had appeared to them, they were talking about the Christ event, how he was a prophet with mighty in words and deed. And that sounds like what we do on Sunday morning and talk about the story of Jesus. But we don't just talk about Jesus. We also talk about the Old Testament. We also quote the Old Testament so that we understand that what Jesus has done, his life, death, and resurrections, it's really totally in line with the teaching of the Old Testament. And then they go into breaking the bread, and then probably the wine too. So it's basically an outline of a worship service. So Luke tries to tell us it is in worship service that we experience Jesus. However, if that's the whole story, then the story could be a little bit boring. I can say that because I'm the creation of boredom in service. Me and creatures like myself. We try to send everybody into the sermon, kind of a sermon death or something, So this is the moment in time that people probably have more serving on the net or whatever. But that's besides the point. But the more important point, if you look at the story more carefully, there are other things that is happening, that other human relational settings that are happening where Jesus' presence is felt. So, first of all, the two disciples, when they encountered Jesus, they were relating to one another. They were walking together. Later on, they broke bread. They were having meals, just like some things that we would all do. But also, they're having discussions. It's quite interesting in our translation. There are only two verbs used to describe the discussions. They were talking together. They were discussing. Well, unfortunately, I think these words are a little too tame to translate the three Greek words that are used by Luke to talk about how they talk. The first word is the word that is very close to the word homily that we use today. Actually, homily means basically means talking together. So they're talking together. They're having homily with one another. But the second Greek word that we cannot quite see from the translation is they were debating with one another. Not just having homily. They were actually debating, with very animated. The third verb that, again, not translated right, I think, is even more interesting. In Greek, it's anti-baleti. Now, anti, you know what anti is, right? Anti is you go against each other. And baleti, that word comes from the Greek word balo. Balo is a very simple, very common Greek word meaning throwing things. So when they were together, not only that they just talked to each other, they have a debate with one another. They were doing what? They were not throwing things at each other, but throwing argument, if you will, in animating discussions about life, about things with one another. But the next point is even more important. That is, what are they talking about? What are they talking about? Well, of course, they're talking about what happened in Jerusalem, that Jesus was put to death unjustly, and so on and so forth. But there's one line in this story that didn't hit me in many years that I was reading it. That line said, Cleopas, the one who explained to Jesus what they were talking about, he was saying that, talking about Jesus and all that, and then he said, I was hoping that he would be the one who would come to redeem Israel. He would come to redeem Israel. Now, sometimes when we hear the word redeem, we immediately think about sin and all the religious thing that comes to mind, right? But the word redeem is a very powerful, strong word. The word redeem actually comes from the word that means ransom. What is a ransom? Ransom is when somebody catch your family, imprison your family, and then they would extort you. They would ask you for ransom dollars. If you don't pay up, your loved one will not be released. So in fact, the word ransom, it comes from a very simple Greek word. Simply means release. So what Cleopas was saying was they and many others, Israelites, were hoping and praying for the day when God would send someone to release them, to liberate them from the bondage of captivity. And the captivity they're talking about is political and religious captivities. And I think we talked about those things in the past. That is, at the time, they did not have the freedom. And so they were hoping for someone to come and liberate them. So this is really powerful things. So what we are hearing is these two people were in relationship with one another, not only just walking together and talking together, but talking about something that they feel that they are suffering from. And then they're talking about injustice. They're talking about how God could assist them in that process of finding liberation in the brokenness of their lives, finding help, finding freedom among the bondage. So it is in that kind of setting, that Jesus appears to them. So that goes to the third main point. What does it look like? What does it look like when Jesus appears to us? When we are allowed to see Jesus? Well, according to the description here, they did not even know that Jesus was walking with them until the breaking of bread. Of course, it reminds us of the Holy Communion. But then, the next part was interesting. The moment they recognized Jesus, or their eyes were opened to have Jesus, recognizing Jesus, what happened to Jesus? Jesus vanished. So the sight of Jesus is never an enduring thing. It would be very different. It's certainly not like Jesus wearing a name badge. He said, "I'm Jesus, here's my business card," and all that stuff, and then staying with us for hours and days and years and whatnot. No. Recognizing Jesus is often those moments in time that somehow we individually and collectively have a glimpse of the divine in some very specific way. And with that, they begin to realize, oh my gosh, all along, even when we were not aware of Jesus' presence, Jesus was with us. And then our hearts have been burning. Our hearts have been burnt with warmth and glow and light during those processes. But what's next is just as important. Once they are aware that Jesus is present with them, they made different decisions. They were going to stay in Emmaus, but instead they decided to walk back 7 miles to go back to Jerusalem right away. So experiencing Jesus' presence is one of those powerful moments when we all of a sudden have a glimpse of the divine, but just a glimpse. It would disappear. But yet, as we look back, we know that glimpse is not accidental. Jesus, in many ways, has been walking with us all along, tugging our hearts and speaking to us while we do not know, and also moving us into new directions of hope, directions of freedom and redemption, if you will, in our lives. So the question for all of us today is, have we seen Jesus lately? Have you seen Jesus lately? I ask myself that question too, have I seen Jesus lately? The last few days I was in North Carolina. I mentioned my work is with the Disaster Response Ministry of our denomination. I have the opportunity to visit Lumberton. Probably not a town like Charlotte that we heard of, but it's a very small town by the coast that was heavily impacted by Hurricane Matthew on October 9th, just last year. So I had the opportunity to be guided by a wonderful, wonderful city worker to visit 2 families who were heavily impacted by the flood, not so much with the hurricane, but what caused the damage was the flood that came the day afterwards. So I just want to highlight the story of one family and my experience with that meeting. So that the city worker led me to the home of this family, who is now being displaced from the home to a new rental place. what they told me was something I could not even imagine. What they were living at the time of the flood, they were living in the countryside in a trailer home. And nobody knew that the rain was coming, but when it came, nobody had time to escape. So very quickly, on May 9th, the water came into the house and then started flooding, and water reached about 2 or 3 feet level. There's a family of 6. Is a middle-aged man and his wife, and then they have a 20-year-old son, a 25-year-old daughter with the 4-year-old son, and then a 12-year-old daughter. They had to just stand and do whatever they need to do on their bed for 5 days. For 5 days. They could not get out. Water is everywhere. And they even said they see snakes swimming into the house and stuff like that, and even crocodile outside, and okay, wow. And for 5 days later, thank God, they were being rescued. But life did not just all of a sudden, turn into rosy picture. But instead, all kinds of very difficult things happened afterwards. The man could not work. He was the only breadwinner. And then the wife has had to deal with diseases. And then the children have to be sent away because they had no ability to take care of them. And then they have to move to a new rental place, the place that I visited. The place was all right, but in one of the most difficult parts in town, and according to them, there's prostitutions and all kinds of things at the corner. Not some place we want to live in more than one day. And then there are many, many difficulties around. So while I was there, being led by the city workers and kind workers, and the family was very, very generous and sharing their struggles. But also the city worker reminded me, while they were struggling with their own difficulties, they will be helping. They will be at some of those supply places that give out relief supplies. They will be there helping the city workers and the city and other places. So while I was there listening to the story, I was moved. I was moved by the calmness that they shared with me. There's a lot of sorrows and some angers, of course. They were struggling with everybody, the city, FEMA, and everybody else. So I remember at the end of the conversation, I was going to be there for 15 minutes. Well, when you listen to stories of survivors, you don't sit for 15 minutes, but instead at least an hour and a half. So in an hour and a half later, what came to me is I felt very inadequate. I did not come in as a church worker or as a pastor, simply as someone visiting from the outside. I said to the man of the family, I said, I wish I could do something. I wish I could do something. I heard your suffering. I heard your need to find relief and freedom and all those things. I could not do anything. But at that moment, he said to me, that's all right, I understand. But the fact that you are listening, you're willing to sit here to listen my story, that's a relief. To listen to the story from our perspective, that is a relief. And at that very moment, I must say that I have a glimpse of Jesus. Jesus did not come down and change everything. Not a miracle worker, then all of a sudden turn everything into the rosy picture. No. But Jesus was there reminding me, and perhaps reminding all of us, that whatever suffering that this family is going through, they were not alone. Jesus has been walking alongside with them and will continue to walk with them. And also in that very moment, I sensed a slight sense of relief from them. Not that I have done anything for them. I did not. But in our relating to one another, in our ability to share one another, to argue, I don't mean argue, but truly to share lives with one another, Jesus was present at that moment. So sisters and brothers, I know that you have had experienced Jesus' presence before. The question is, can we talk about them? At least can we talk about them to ourselves? And maybe we can share them in a future gathering. But I deeply believe through the years that Jesus is indeed living. Jesus lives in our human relationships, live in our community, live mightily, particularly when we are struggling with our lives, when we are struggling with freedom, and we are struggling with hopefully finding liberation and wellness.